I've been planning birthday parties for 78 years now, and I thought I'd gotten pretty good at it. Name's Henry Callahan, and I spent 43 years designing ship hulls for the Navy before retiring here to Port Townsend 15 years ago. You learn precision in naval engineering. Every calculation matters, every detail counts. That's how I approached this party, my 78th birthday celebration, measuring out portions like I used to calculate load distributions on destroyer frames. Spent 3 weeks getting everything ready in my restored 1892 Victorian on Monroe Street, the one with the wraparound porch that overlooks the harbor. Marilyn, my wife of 52 years, she'd been complaining about the work involved, but I figured she was just being practical like always. Our son David and daughter Sarah both said they'd be there, and even promised to bring the grandkids. Hell, I even hired Mickey Chen's jazz trio from the Silverwater Cafe downtown. Cost me $600, but Sarah always loved live music. I prepared my famous clam chowder using recipes I'd perfected during shore leave decades ago, the kind that made me popular with my engineering crew. Bought 3 cases of that local Finn River cider that David likes, arranged the good china Marilyn's mother left us, and set up tables for 24 people in the front parlor and dining room. Even dug out my dress Navy uniform from the cedar chest, thinking the grandkids might get a kick out of seeing their grandfather in his old blues. The morning of September 15th started gray and drizzly, typical for Port Townsend in early fall, but I was optimistic. I'd been up since 5:30, a habit from my Navy days that never left me. By 8, I had the chowder simmering and the house smelling like a proper celebration. The jazz trio showed up at 11, professional as promised, and set up in the front parlor near the old Steinway piano I'd bought for Marilyn's 60th birthday. Noon came and went. Then 1 o'clock, the musicians kept playing. Bless them, but I could see them exchanging those uncomfortable glances musicians get when they're performing for an audience of one. By 2 o'clock, only 4 people had shown up. Old Pete Garrison from the marina where I keep my 1978 Chris Craft, his wife Betty, and Jim and Carol Morrison from 2 houses down on Monroe Street. Good people, the kind who show up when they say they will but they weren't family. I kept checking my phone, that new iPhone Sarah insisted I get last Christmas. Nothing, not even a missed call. Pete kept trying to make conversation about the harbor dredging project, and Betty complimented the chowder, but I could feel their pity like a weight in my chest. These folks had known me since I moved to town, watched me fix up this old house board by board, seen me at every community meeting and town festival. They knew this wasn't right. Around 3:30 my phone finally buzzed. Text message from Sarah, busy today. We'll catch up soon. That was it. 52 years of birthdays with Marilyn, 35 years of Sarah's life, 38 years of David's existence, and I got 8 words. Not even an apology or explanation. Just busy today like I was some casual acquaintance asking for a lunch date. The jazz trio played until 4, fulfilling their contract like the professionals they were. I paid them the full amount plus a tip, shook their hands, and thanked them for a lovely afternoon. Pete and Betty stayed until nearly 5, helping me clean up dishes and pack away the untouched food. Jim Morrison helped me move the tables back, his weathered carpenter's hands working alongside mine like we were raising a barn instead of cleaning up a failed party. After everyone left, I sat in my study with a glass of Jameson and stared at the harbor through the window. 43 years of naval service, 37 years of mortgage payments on this house, thousands of dollars spent on family vacations and college tuitions and wedding expenses. I own this house outright, plus 3 rental properties on Water Street that brought in steady income. I'd planned and budgeted and saved like the good engineer I was trained to be. But sitting there in the growing darkness, watching the harbor lights flicker on, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my first week of boot camp in 1963, complete and utter isolation. That's when Pete Garrison called. "Henry," he said, his voice careful like he was navigating around something dangerous. "I don't want to stir up trouble, but I think you should know. I saw your family today." My hand tightened on the phone. "Oh, they were all dressed up, heading into that big house on Bluff Street. You know, your brother's place. Looked like they were going to some kind of celebration. Marilyn was carrying flowers, and I saw balloons in David's car. Pete paused, and I could hear his reluctance. I'm sorry, Henry. I thought you should know. I thanked Pete and hung up, my engineering mind already processing this new information like stress calculations on a hull design. They hadn't been busy. They hadn't forgotten. They'd made a choice. My family, my wife of 52 years, my 2 children, my 4 grandchildren, had deliberately chosen to attend my younger brother's celebration instead of mine, whatever celebration that was. I sat there until well past midnight, nursing that Jameson and staring at my empty house. But something else was stirring in my chest besides hurt and loneliness. Something calculating and methodical, honed by decades of solving complex engineering problems. I'd always been good at analyzing structural weaknesses, identifying points of failure in systems that looked solid from the outside. Maybe it was time to apply those skills closer to home. The truth came out 3 days later over coffee at the Salal Cafe on Water Street. I was sitting at my usual corner table, the one with a clear view of the marina, when Chuck Patterson walked in. Chuck served with me on the USS Constellation back in '68, moved up here from Bremerton after his retirement. He spotted me immediately, his weathered face showing that particular expression I'd learned to recognize, the look of a man carrying uncomfortable news. Henry, he said, sliding into the opposite chair without invitation. We need to talk. I set down my coffee cup, noting the precise way Chuck arranged his hands on the table. Another Navy habit. About what? About Saturday. About your family. Chuck's eyes met mine directly. I was at the hardware store Monday morning, and I overheard something I think you need to know. Your brother was in there, talking to Bill Henderson about some big property deal. Mentioned celebrating his retirement windfalls over the weekend with family support. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. My younger brother Robert, 2 years behind me, always the charmer, always the one who needed help. I'd bailed him out more times than I could count over the decades. The business loan in 1987, when his restaurant failed. The mortgage payment in 1995, when he couldn't make rent on that antique shop. The car loan in 2003, when his credit was shot. Each time he'd promised it was the last time, and each time I'd believed him because that's what big brothers do. What kind of windfall? I asked, though my engineering instincts were already calculating possibilities. Chuck leaned forward. That's the thing, Henry. Bill said your brother was talking about new property investments, and mentioned your kids were helping him leverage family assets. Whatever that means. He paused, studying my face. I'm probably speaking out of turn, but it sounded like your family thinks Robert's got money to throw around now. I thought about Robert's track record. Divorced twice, bankrupted 3 businesses, never held a steady job for more than 2 years. The only reason he owned that house on Bluff Street was because I'd co-signed the mortgage in 2010 when nobody else would touch his credit application. Yet somehow, he was throwing parties and talking about property investments, while I sat alone in my house on my 78th birthday. That afternoon, I drove past Robert's place on Bluff Street. The house I'd helped him buy, the mortgage I'd guaranteed when his credit couldn't handle it alone. There were cars in the driveway, expensive cars. A new BMW that looked like the one David had been eyeing for months. A Lexus SUV similar to the one Sarah had mentioned wanting for the grandkids. My wife's Honda was parked there too, like she belonged there more than at our own home. I didn't stop. Instead, I drove down to the marina and walked the docks, thinking, the rhythmic sound of halyards clanging against masts always helped me process complex problems. This felt like those engineering challenges I used to face, multiple variables, hidden stresses, systems that appeared stable until you looked at the underlying structure. When I got home around 6, Marilyn was in the kitchen, humming while she prepared dinner. She looked up when I walked in, her expression carefully neutral. How was your day, Henry? Fine, I said, settling into my usual chair at the kitchen table. Ran into Chuck Patterson at the cafe. He mentioned seeing quite a celebration at Robert's place over the weekend. Marilyn's hands stilled for just a moment, a tell I'd learned to recognize over 5 decades of marriage. Oh, that's nice for Robert. Chuck said it looked like a family gathering. Cars in the driveway, people celebrating something. I kept my voice conversational, the same tone I'd used when questioning junior engineers about miscalculations. I wouldn't know, Marilyn said, turning back to the stove. I spent Saturday afternoon working in the garden. But she was lying. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, hear it in the slight tremor of her voice. After 52 years of marriage, you learn to read the signs like instrument gauges on a ship's bridge. My wife, the woman who'd promised to stand by me through everything, was lying to my face about where she'd spent my birthday. The next morning, I had my neighbor Dorothy drop by with some tomatoes from her garden. Dorothy Chen, Mickey's aunt, actually, and the unofficial neighborhood information network. She'd lived on Monroe Street longer than anyone, watched every family drama unfold from her front porch like a benevolent spy. "Henry," she said, settling into the porch rocker with practiced ease, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but how are things with your family? I couldn't help but notice they weren't here for your birthday celebration." I'd always liked Dorothy's directness. They had other obligations. She nodded slowly, her weathered hands folding over the tomato basket. "I see. It's just that I heard from my friend Margaret. She works part-time at the bank. She mentioned your kids have been asking questions about property values recently. Something about helping someone with family investment opportunities." The pieces clicked into place like components in a well-designed machine. My children weren't just attending Robert's party. They were involved in whatever scheme he was running. And if they were asking about property values, they were probably looking at my property values. The Victorian house, the 3 rental properties on Water Street, maybe even the marina property I'd quietly purchased through an LLC back in 2015. That marina property was my secret pride, a small but profitable piece of the waterfront that I'd bought when old Captain Morrison needed cash quickly. The deal was structured through Peninsula Holdings LLC, a company name that appeared on very few documents. Even Marilyn didn't know about it, though the income had quietly supplemented our retirement for years. After Dorothy left, I sat on my porch for a long time, watching the harbor traffic and thinking about loyalty, about 52 years of marriage, about raising 2 children, about countless family dinners and birthday celebrations and Christmas mornings, about the times I'd worked double shifts to pay for their college educations, the down payment I'd given David for his first house, the wedding I'd paid for when Sarah married that lawyer who turned out to be more interested in family connections than family values. When I finally went inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. On the hall table where Marilyn always sorted the mail was a legal envelope addressed to her. The return address read Henderson and Associates, Property Law. The envelope was unopened, but it was marked Urgent Property Transfer Request. I stared at that envelope for a long time, my hands steady despite the fury building in my chest. In 43 years of naval service, I'd learned that the most dangerous threats were often the ones that came from inside your own ship. They came home on Thursday evening like nothing had happened. Marilyn walked through the front door at 6:15, carrying grocery bags and humming that tune she'd been singing all week. David and Sarah followed an hour later, both of them wearing expressions I'd seen before during family meetings about important decisions, the kind where they'd already made up their minds and were just going through the motions of consulting me. "Hey, Dad," David said, settling into the living room armchair like he owned it. At 38, he'd inherited my height, and Marilyn's diplomatic nature, though lately, that diplomacy felt more like calculation. "We should talk about some family business." Sarah sat on the couch beside her mother, her laptop bag conspicuously present. My daughter had always been the organized one, the planner, the one who made lists and kept schedules. At 35, she managed portfolios for a financial planning firm in Seattle, drove up to Port Townsend twice a month for family visits that had started feeling more like inspections. "What kind of business?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Property management," Sarah said, opening her laptop with practiced efficiency. "We've been researching some opportunities that could benefit everyone in the family." I watched her navigate to what looked like a real estate website, noting the way David leaned forward with interest, and Marilyn nodded approvingly. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation. This was a presentation they'd rehearsed, probably at Robert's house while I was sitting alone with my birthday chowder. "See, Dad," Uncle Robert has been working with some investors on property development projects around the county. David explained, there's real potential for significant returns, but it requires pooling family resources to meet the minimum investment thresholds. I listened with the patience I'd learned during budget meetings with Navy procurement officers. Let them talk, let them reveal their assumptions, let them expose the weaknesses in their logic. Sarah showed me charts and projections, numbers that looked impressive until you realized they were based on Robert's track record of financial disasters. The thing is, Sarah continued, to maximize our position, we need to consolidate some of the family assets, streamline ownership structures, reduce tax burdens, that sort of thing. Consolidate how? I asked. Marilyn spoke up for the first time. Sarah thinks it would be smart to transfer the properties into a family trust. Better protection, easier management as we get older. As we get older. Like I'd suddenly become incompetent to manage properties I'd owned and maintained for decades. Like the naval engineer who'd supervised million-dollar ship construction projects couldn't handle rental property maintenance and tax filings. Over the next few days, I watched my family with new eyes. Marilyn started locking her desk drawer, something she'd never done in 52 years of marriage. She'd sit there in the evenings with legal documents spread out, making phone calls in a low voice that stopped whenever I entered the room. When I asked about the calls, she'd smile and say she was just handling some paperwork. David showed up on Saturday morning with his camera, saying he needed to take photos of the house for insurance purposes. But I noticed he was documenting more than just the structure. He photographed the antique furniture, the artwork, the china cabinet, even the contents of my study. When I asked why the insurance company needed pictures of my books and ship models, he laughed and said it was better to be thorough. Sarah's visits increased to 3 times a week. She'd arrive with her laptop and briefcase, settling into the dining room like it was her office. I'd hear her on conference calls, discussing property valuations and asset optimization with people whose voices I didn't recognize. When I asked who she was talking to, she'd say it was just work stuff and change the subject. But the most telling sign was how they interacted with each other. There were meaningful glances across the dinner table, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, and a general atmosphere of secrets being kept. They moved through my house like conspirators, which I suppose they were. One evening, I overheard Sarah on the phone in the kitchen, her voice low but not quite low enough. No, he hasn't signed anything yet. Mom's working on it. But you know how stubborn he can be. We need to be patient and let her handle the persuasion. Persuasion. Like I was some obstacle to be managed, rather than the patriarch of the family they were supposedly trying to help. I started paying closer attention to the mail. Bills arrived addressed to me, but they'd been opened and resealed with tape. Property tax statements disappeared from the stack before I could review them. When I asked Marilyn about the missing mail, she said she was just trying to help by organizing our paperwork more efficiently. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when I found Sarah in my study, going through my filing cabinet. She looked up when I entered, not even having the grace to appear embarrassed. "Hi, Dad. I was just looking for those property deeds. For the insurance documentation, the deeds are in my safety deposit box at Peninsula Bank," I said calmly. "They have been for 20 years." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, or disappointment? "Oh, well, we'll need copies eventually for the trust paperwork." "What trust paperwork?" "The family trust we discussed. Mom said you were considering it." I hadn't agreed to consider anything, but clearly the story had evolved in the retelling. In my family's version of events, I was already on board with their plan. They were just working out the details of how to implement my decision. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat in my study with a glass of Jameson and thought about the safety deposit box at Peninsula Bank. Inside that box were the original deeds to all my properties, including the Peninsula Holdings LLC documentation for the marina property. Also in that box were my original will and testament, the life insurance policies that would pay out $800,000 upon my death, and the financial records showing the true extent of my assets. My family thought they knew what I was worth. They'd calculated the value of the house and the rental properties, factored in my Navy pension and Social Security, and apparently decided it was enough to justify whatever scheme Robert had convinced them to join. But they didn't know about the marina property, the shipbuilding partnership shares I'd retained from my consulting years, or the municipal bonds I'd been buying quietly for the past 15 years. Most importantly, they didn't know that I'd learned to read people as carefully as I'd once read technical specifications. And right now, my family was sending me very clear signals about their intentions. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen table. Family meeting tonight at 7 o'clock. Important decisions to discuss. Please be available. Marilyn. A note. In my own house. Like I was an employee being summoned to a board meeting. I folded the note carefully and put it in my pocket. Then walked down to the marina to think. The morning fog was just lifting off the harbor, and I could see Robert's house on Bluff Street in the distance. From this angle, it looked impressive and successful, the kind of place where important business decisions might be made. But I knew something Robert's new partners didn't know. I knew the foundation of that house had settlement issues that would require expensive repairs within 5 years. I knew because I'd co-signed the mortgage and had insisted on a thorough inspection before putting my credit on the line. Just like I knew my family was about to learn something they hadn't anticipated about the man they thought they could manage, they assembled in my living room at exactly 7 o'clock like a military operation. Marilyn sat in her usual spot on the couch, but she'd moved the coffee table closer and spread out a manila folder full of documents. Sarah took the chair nearest to the folder, her laptop open and ready. David positioned himself by the fireplace, standing rather than sitting, like he was preparing to give a presentation to the board of directors. I settled into my recliner, the same chair I'd been using for evening reading for the past 15 years, and waited for them to begin. In Naval Command meetings, you learn the value of letting the other party speak first. They'd reveal their position, their assumptions, and most importantly, their weaknesses. Henry, Marilyn began, using my formal name instead of the honey she'd called me for 5 decades. We need to discuss your future, our future. Sarah leaned forward, her financial planner demeanor in full display. Dad, we've been researching care options for seniors, and we think it's time to be proactive about planning for your needs as you age. My needs seem to be met just fine right now, I said calmly. David stepped in, his voice carrying that tone he used when explaining things to his teenage kids. The thing is, Dad, this house is becoming too much for you to maintain. 3 stories, all those stairs, the yard work, and Mom's been worried about your forgetfulness lately. Forgetfulness? I looked at Marilyn, who couldn't meet my eyes. What forgetfulness? Little things, she said quietly. You sometimes forget where you put your keys, or you'll ask me the same question twice. I'd been an engineer for 43 years. I'd memorized technical specifications for ship systems that covered thousands of pages, managed construction projects with hundreds of variables, and maintained detailed records that Navy inspectors could never fault. But apparently, misplacing my keys twice in 6 months constituted evidence of cognitive decline. We've found a wonderful assisted living community in Sequim, Sarah continued, sliding a glossy brochure across the coffee table. Sunset Manor. It's got everything. Meal service, housekeeping, social activities, and most importantly, medical supervision. I glanced at the brochure without picking it up. Sunset Manor looked pleasant enough in the photographs, but I noticed the fine print at the bottom, starting at $4,800 per month, nearly $60,000 a year, not counting the additional fees that places like this always added for premium services. And the best part, David added, is that moving there would free up your assets to be managed more efficiently. No more property maintenance, no more tax complications, no more stress about financial decisions. Sarah opened her laptop, angling the screen so I could see a spreadsheet she'd prepared. I've run the numbers, Dad. Between the sale of this house and the rental properties, plus proper investment of the proceeds, there would be more than enough to cover your care costs indefinitely. I studied the spreadsheet, noting the property values she'd estimated. They were accurate for the house and 2 of the rental properties, but she'd missed the 3rd property entirely, the duplex on Water Street that I'd bought through a separate LLC in 2018. More interestingly, there was no mention of the marina property or any of my other investments. This is very thorough, I said. But I'm curious about something. You've listed the house at $425,000 and the rental properties at $280,000 each. Where did you get those valuations? We had Robert's real estate contact do a preliminary assessment, Marilyn said, just to get a baseline for planning purposes. Of course they did. Robert's real estate contact, probably someone who'd give them the numbers they wanted to hear. Someone who'd conveniently undervalue the properties to make the assisted living option look more affordable than it actually was. The important thing, Sarah pressed on, is getting the legal framework in place now while you're still competent to make these decisions yourself. Still competent. The implication being that my competence was temporary and declining. I looked around the room at my family. My wife of 52 years, my 2 children, whom I'd raised and educated and supported through every crisis in their lives, and saw 3 strangers who were discussing my life like I was already gone. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. We've taken the liberty of having an attorney prepare the necessary paperwork. Power of attorney documents that would allow Mom and Sarah to handle your financial affairs more efficiently. He unfolded the papers and set them on the coffee table beside the assisted living brochure. I could see they were pre-filled forms, with my name typed in the appropriate blanks and signature lines highlighted in yellow. All I had to do was sign, and control of my assets would transfer to my family for my own protection. The attorney said these are standard documents, Sarah explained. Durable power of attorney for finances and a separate one for healthcare decisions. It just formalizes what we'd naturally do anyway. Help you manage things as you get older. I picked up the financial power of attorney document and read it carefully, using the same attention to detail I'd applied to Navy contracts. The language was broad and permissive, essentially giving my appointed agents complete control over my bank accounts, property transactions, and investment decisions. Once signed, I would become a passenger in my own financial life. This is quite comprehensive, I said, setting the document back on the table. I notice it includes provisions for property sales and transfers. That's a significant responsibility to put on you and your mother. We're willing to take that responsibility, Sarah said quickly. It's what families do for each other. Families? I thought about my 78th birthday party, about the empty chairs and the unanswered phone calls and the text message that dismissed 52 years of birthdays with 8 casual words. I thought about the secret meetings at Robert's house, the documents they'd prepared without consulting me, and the assisted living facility they'd selected for my future. I appreciate all the work you've put into this, I said, standing up slowly, using the careful movements of a man who wanted to appear older and more fragile than he actually was. It's a lot to process. I'll need some time to think it over. The disappointment in the room was palpable. They'd expected me to sign immediately, grateful for their guidance, and relieved to transfer the burden of decision-making to younger, more capable hands. Of course, Dad, David said, though his tone suggested this wasn't the response he'd hoped for. Take all the time you need, but don't wait too long. These kinds of legal arrangements work best when they're implemented sooner rather than later. After they left, I sat alone in my living room, looking at the documents they'd left behind. The power of attorney forms, the assisted living brochure, and Sarah's spreadsheet with its carefully calculated vision of my future. Everything organized, efficient, and completely lacking my input except for the signature they needed to make it legal. I walked to my study and opened the bottom drawer of my desk, where I kept my personal phone directory. I found the number I was looking for and dialed, despite the late hour. Reynolds Law Office, this is the answering service. This is Henry Callahan. I need to speak with Jim Reynolds as soon as possible. It's urgent. Jim Reynolds and I had served together on the USS Constellation, and he'd built a successful law practice in Port Angeles after leaving the Navy. More importantly, he was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my financial situation, having helped me structure some of my property investments over the years. I'll have Mr. Reynolds call you first thing in the morning, sir. I hung up and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor lights. Tomorrow I'd learn exactly what my family's legal documents would mean for my future. Tonight, I'd start planning my response. In the Navy, we had a saying, the best defense is a good offense. It was time to put that principle to work. Jim Reynolds called at 7:30 the next morning, his voice carrying that crisp authority I remembered from our Navy days. "Henry, I got your message. What's the situation?" I explained the family meeting, the power of attorney documents, and the assisted living plan they'd developed without my knowledge. Jim listened without interruption, a skill he'd developed as both a Navy officer and a successful attorney. "Bring the documents to my office this afternoon," he said when I finished. "And Henry, don't sign anything until we've had a chance to review this properly." I drove to Port Angeles after lunch, taking the scenic route along Highway 20 to give myself time to think. The Olympic Mountains rose to my left, their peaks dusted with early snow, while the Strait of Juan de Fuca stretched toward Vancouver Island on my right. I'd made this drive hundreds of times over the years, but today it felt different, like I was crossing into enemy territory to gather intelligence. Jim's office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Port Angeles, with windows overlooking the harbor. At 76, he was 2 years younger than me, but carried himself with the same upright bearing I recognized in old military men. His handshake was firm, his gray eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Let's see what they've prepared for you," he said, settling behind his desk and adjusting his reading glasses. I watched him review the power of attorney documents, noting the way his expression grew more serious as he read. Occasionally he'd make notes in the margins or underline specific passages. After 20 minutes he set the papers aside and looked at me directly. "Henry, these documents would essentially strip you of financial autonomy. Your family would have complete control over your assets, including the authority to sell your properties, close your accounts, and make investment decisions without your consent." That's what I thought, but I wanted a professional opinion. More concerning is the assisted living component. Once you're in a facility like Sunset Manor, it becomes very difficult to reverse these arrangements, especially if your family argues that you're no longer competent to make financial decisions. Jim leaned back in his chair. "Have you given them any indication that you're experiencing cognitive issues?" "I misplaced my car keys twice in 6 months. Apparently, that constitutes grounds for declaring me mentally incompetent." Jim's expression hardened. "I've seen this pattern before, Henry. Adult children who convince themselves they're acting in their parents' best interest while positioning themselves to benefit financially. The fact that they prepared these documents without consulting you first is a significant red flag." We spent the next hour reviewing my actual financial situation. Jim pulled out files from our previous meetings, documents that detailed the full scope of my assets, the marina property through Peninsula Holdings LLC, the retained shares in Pacific Maritime Engineering from my consulting years, the municipal bonds, the CD ladder I'd built over 15 years of careful investing. "Your family's calculations are based on roughly half of your actual net worth," Jim observed. "They're either remarkably uninformed about your finances, or they're deliberately underestimating your assets for their own purposes. Probably both. They think they know everything because Sarah works in financial planning, but they've never asked me for a complete financial disclosure." "Well, that works in your favor now. If they don't know the full extent of your holdings, they can't plan around them." Jim made another note. "What are you thinking in terms of response?" "I want to update my will completely, and I want to explore options for protecting my assets from this kind of manipulation." Jim nodded approvingly. "Smart move. We can establish an irrevocable trust that would protect your property from creditors and family interference. We can also update your will to reflect your current wishes rather than assumptions made decades ago." We worked until nearly 6 o'clock, drafting new documents that would secure my independence while ensuring my assets went where I actually wanted them to go. The irrevocable trust would be funded by transferring my properties and investments, with income flowing back to me during my lifetime and principal going to designated beneficiaries upon my death. "Who do you want as beneficiaries?" Jim asked. I thought about my 78th birthday party, about the empty chairs in the family meeting where they'd planned my future without me, the Port Townsend Maritime Museum for the properties, the local veterans organization for the financial assets, Maybe set up a scholarship fund for young people studying naval engineering. Jim raised an eyebrow. Nothing for your wife and children. They'll inherit what they've earned through their loyalty and respect. Right now, that appears to be nothing. On the drive home, I stopped at Peninsula Bank and visited my safety deposit box, reviewing the original documents I'd kept secure for decades. Property deeds, stock certificates, insurance policies, and the original will that left everything to Marilyn and the kids. That will had been written 20 years ago, when I still believed family loyalty was reciprocal. I also retrieved a business card I'd kept since my retirement. Marcus Webb, a former apprentice from my naval engineering days, who'd built a successful real estate development company in Seattle. Marcus had called me 6 months ago about purchasing some waterfront property for a boutique hotel project, offering a price that seemed almost too good to be true. That evening, I called Marcus from my study while Marilyn watched television in the living room. "Marcus, it's Henry Callahan. Remember that waterfront parcel you were interested in? I might be ready to discuss terms." "Henry, great to hear from you. I was hoping you'd reconsider. The market for waterfront development has only gotten stronger since we last talked. What kind of timeline are you looking at? If you're serious about selling, I could have a purchase agreement ready within a week. Cash deal, no financing contingencies, closed within 30 days. I smiled, thinking about Sarah's spreadsheet and her carefully calculated projections. "Let's set up a meeting. But Marcus, I need this kept confidential until the deal closes. Family complications." "Understood completely. I'll have my attorney prepare a non-disclosure agreement along with the purchase docs." After hanging up, I sat in my study reviewing the chessboard Marilyn had given me for Christmas several years ago. I'd been playing chess since my Navy days, and I'd learned that the most effective strategies often involve sacrificing pieces your opponent thought were valuable, while protecting assets they didn't know existed. My family thought they understood my position. They'd calculated my net worth, planned my future, and prepared legal documents based on their assumptions about my capabilities and assets. But they'd made a fundamental error. They'd planned their strategy around incomplete information. The next morning, I called Jim Reynolds to give him the go-ahead on the trust documents. "How quickly can we get this executed?" "If you're willing to drive over here tomorrow, we can have everything signed and notarized by end of business. The trust will be effective immediately upon execution." "Do it." That afternoon, I received another piece of information that confirmed my instincts. Dorothy Chen knocked on my door, ostensibly to return a book I'd lent her, but actually to deliver neighborhood intelligence. "Henry, I don't want to worry you, but I saw a real estate agent taking pictures of your house yesterday morning. Young woman with a fancy camera, spent about an hour walking around the property." I thanked Dorothy and walked out to my front yard, looking at my house with new eyes. Someone had been evaluating it for sale without my knowledge, probably getting updated comps to support their assisted living calculations. The violation felt more personal than anything that had happened so far. That evening, I found Marilyn in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming that same tune she'd been singing since my birthday party. "Marilyn, we need to talk." She looked up, her expression immediately guarded. "About what?" "About our future, about those power of attorney documents, about the decisions that seem to be getting made without my input." She set down her wooden spoon and faced me directly. "Henry, we're trying to help you. We're trying to make things easier." "Easier for whom?" That question hung in the air between us like smoke from a distant fire. She couldn't answer it honestly, because the truth was that they were making things easier for themselves, not for me. "I'll consider the documents," I said finally, "but I need more time to understand the implications." Relief flickered across her face. "Of course, take all the time you need." But as I watched her return to dinner preparation, I realized she didn't understand that I'd already made my decision. The time for consideration was over. Now it was time for action. The trust documents were executed on a crisp Thursday morning in Jim Reynolds' office, with 2 witnesses present and a notary public who'd been practicing law longer than my children had been alive. I signed each page carefully, my naval training making me read every clause one final time before committing my signature to paper. "The Callahan Family Trust is now legally established," Jim announced, gathering the papers into a neat stack. All properties and specified assets will transfer into the trust within 30 days, with you maintaining lifetime income rights and the Port Townsend Maritime Museum designated as the primary beneficiary upon your death. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For the first time since my birthday party, I was operating from a position of strength rather than reaction. What about the power of attorney documents my family prepared? They're worthless now. You can't grant power of attorney over assets you no longer own, and the trust is structured to prevent any external control or manipulation. Jim smiled grimly. Your house, your rental properties, and your investment accounts are now legally protected from the kind of family interference you've been experiencing. On the drive home, I stopped at Peninsula Bank and met with Marcus Webb, who'd driven up from Seattle with his attorney and a cashier's check for $847,000, the purchase price for the waterfront parcel my family didn't know I owned. The closing took less than an hour, and I walked out with enough liquid capital to fund whatever came next. Pleasure doing business with you, Henry, Marcus said, shaking my hand in the parking lot. If you ever have other properties you're looking to move, give me a call. I pay fair prices, and I don't ask unnecessary questions. That afternoon I drove to the Port Townsend Maritime Museum and met with Carol Hendricks, the executive director. Carol was a retired Navy commander who'd moved to Port Townsend 5 years earlier to take over the museum, and she'd been working to expand their educational programs and facility. Henry, this is incredibly generous, she said, reviewing the trust documents that designated the museum as my primary beneficiary. The properties alone would allow us to establish the Maritime Education Center we've been dreaming about for years. That's the idea. I want young people to learn about naval engineering and shipbuilding, to understand the importance of maritime industries to our region. I paused, looking around her cluttered office. But Carol, I need to ask for discretion about this arrangement. There may be some family complications. She nodded understandingly. Military families can be complex when it comes to inheritance issues. We'll keep this confidential until you're ready to make it public. That evening I started socializing more intentionally around town. I had dinner at the Silverwater Cafe with Pete Garrison and his wife, discussing marina improvements and harbor dredging projects. I attended the Thursday evening veterans gathering at the VFW Hall, sharing stories and reconnecting with old friends I'd been neglecting in favor of family obligations. The veterans were particularly interesting to talk with. Men like Chuck Patterson, Bob Morrison, and Eddie Yamamoto, guys who'd served their country, built successful civilian careers, and understood the value of loyalty and respect. When I mentioned casually that I was having some family disagreements about my future, they nodded with knowing expressions. It's hard when your kids think they know better than you do, Bob said over his beer. My daughter tried to convince me to sell my shop and move into one of those retirement places. Told me I was too old to be working on cars anymore. What did you do? I asked. I told her she could mind her own business, or find herself written out of my will. Haven't heard any more suggestions about retirement since then. The other men laughed, but there was an underlying seriousness to the conversation. These were men who'd earned their independence through decades of hard work and military service, and they weren't interested in surrendering it to children who mistook concern for control. Over the weekend, I continued my preparations. I visited my rental properties on Water Street, walking through each unit and making notes about needed improvements. The tenants were good people, a young teacher, a retired librarian, and a couple who ran a small pottery studio, and they deserved to have a landlord who was invested in maintaining quality housing. I also spent time in my workshop behind the house, a space I'd built to pursue woodworking and small boat restoration projects. It felt good to work with my hands again, to focus on problems that could be solved with careful measurement and precise cutting, rather than family politics and legal maneuvering. On Sunday afternoon, Sarah called to invite me to a family dinner at Robert's house. Nothing formal, Dad, just a chance for everyone to spend time together and maybe discuss some of those planning issues we talked about last week. What planning issues? I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. The power of attorney documents, the assisted living arrangements, that sort of thing. Uncle Robert has some insights about managing family assets that might be helpful. Of course he did. Robert, who'd bankrupted 3 businesses and needed financial bailouts every few years, apparently had insights about asset management that I'd missed during my 43 years of naval service and 15 years of successful retirement planning. When is this dinner? Tuesday evening, 6 o'clock. It's Robert's birthday, actually, so we're combining celebration with business. Robert's birthday? I'd forgotten completely, which was unusual for me. But then again, Robert had never made much effort to remember mine, so perhaps we were even on that score. I'll be there, I said. After hanging up, I walked down to the marina and spent an hour aboard my Chris Craft, checking systems and cleaning the brass fittings. The boat had been my retirement gift to myself, a 1978 Commander that I'd restored to better than original condition over 5 years of patient work. It was the kind of project that required both technical knowledge and hands-on skill, exactly the combination that had defined my career. Sitting in the boat's cockpit, looking across the harbor toward Robert's house on Bluff Street, I realized that Tuesday's dinner would probably be my last family gathering, as they currently understood our relationships. After that, things would change permanently. I thought about calling Jim Reynolds to give him a heads up about what was coming, but decided against it. The trust documents were filed, the assets were protected, and my will had been updated. The legal framework was in place. Now it was just a matter of letting my family discover the new reality I'd created. That evening, I found an invitation on the kitchen counter that I hadn't seen before, elegant cardstock with embossed lettering, inviting me to a special birthday celebration for Robert Callahan at his residence on Tuesday evening. Below the invitation details was a handwritten note, looking forward to finalizing our family business discussions in a festive atmosphere. Finalizing. Like the business had already been concluded, and we were just going through the ceremony of making it official. Like my signature on their power of attorney documents was a foregone conclusion rather than a decision I had yet to make. I set the invitation aside and made myself a simple dinner, thinking about the difference between a celebration and an ambush. Tuesday would tell me which one I was actually attending. Robert's house was blazing with lights when I arrived Tuesday evening. Cars lined up in the driveway like a small convention. I recognized David's BMW, Sarah's Lexus, and Marilyn's Honda, but there were 3 other vehicles I didn't know, expensive sedans that suggested Robert's guest list had expanded beyond family. The front door opened before I could knock, and Robert greeted me with an enthusiasm that seemed rehearsed. At 76, my younger brother had retained the charm that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life, though his hairline had retreated and his waistline had expanded considerably since his restaurant days. "Henry, glad you could make it. Come in, come in. Everyone's in the living room." The living room was set up like a business meeting, disguised as a social gathering. Marilyn sat on the couch beside Sarah, who had her laptop open on the coffee table. David stood near the fireplace with a man I didn't recognize. 40-something, expensive suit, briefcase at his feet. 2 other strangers occupied chairs near the window, both carrying the calculated friendliness of people who had something to sell. "Henry, I'd like you to meet some associates of mine," Robert said, guiding me toward the strangers. "This is Richard Stone from Peninsula Development Group, and these are Tom and Janet Morrison from Cascade Property Management." I shook hands with each of them, noting the way they assessed me with professional interest. Not the interest of people meeting a family member, but the evaluation of people sizing up a business opportunity. "Mr. Callahan," Richard Stone said, "your brother has told us wonderful things about your property holdings in Port Townsend. We're always interested in working with established local investors. Are you?" I settled into the chair they'd apparently reserved for me, directly facing the coffee table where Sarah's laptop displayed what looked like a presentation slide. "What kind of work are you interested in?" "Property development, primarily. We specialize in helping property owners maximize their return on investment through strategic partnerships and asset optimization." Asset optimization. The same phrase Sarah had used during our family meeting. I was beginning to understand that this dinner was the next phase of their campaign to gain control of my property. Dinner was served in the dining room, with me seated at the head of the table like the guest of honor. The conversation was carefully managed, moving from general topics about Port Townsend's growth to specific discussions about property values and development opportunities. I listened more than I spoke, learning about their plans. The key, Tom Morrison explained over the main course, is leveraging existing property assets to fund larger development projects. An individual property owner might have, say, 3 rental units, generating modest income. But if those properties are used as collateral for a larger development loan, the same owner could participate in projects generating much higher returns. Sounds risky, I observed. All investment involves risk, Richard Stone replied smoothly. But we minimize risk through careful planning and experienced management. That's where family partnerships become so valuable, pooling resources and expertise to pursue opportunities that wouldn't be available to individual investors. I glanced at Robert, who was nodding enthusiastically. These gentlemen have helped me understand opportunities I never would have considered on my own. The potential returns are extraordinary. Returns. Robert was talking about returns from investments he hadn't made yet, using capital he didn't have, backed by properties he didn't own. But apparently, my properties could serve as the foundation for his investment dreams. After dinner, we returned to the living room for what Sarah announced as the business portion of the evening. She opened her laptop and began a presentation that was far more detailed than anything she'd shown me at home. Dad, we've put together a comprehensive plan that addresses your care needs while maximizing the value of your assets for the entire family, she began, clicking through slides that showed property photos, financial projections, and organizational charts. The plan was ambitious. My house would be sold to fund my assisted living costs. The rental properties would be transferred to a family limited partnership, with Robert serving as managing partner and my children as limited partners. The partnership would then leverage those properties to invest in Richard Stone's development projects, generating returns that would benefit everyone involved. The beautiful part, David added, is that you wouldn't have to worry about any of the management responsibilities. We'd handle everything: property maintenance, tenant relations, investment decisions, tax filings. You could focus on enjoying retirement in a facility that costs $60,000 a year, while my life's work funded investment schemes managed by people whose track record included multiple bankruptcies and failed businesses. This all depends on the power of attorney arrangements we discussed. Sarah continued, once those are in place, we can move quickly to implement the plan and start generating improved returns on your assets. Janet Morrison leaned forward. Mr. Callahan, I want to emphasize how unusual it is to have family members willing to take on this level of responsibility. Most elderly property owners struggle with management issues, tenant problems, and tax complications. Your family is offering to handle all of that for you. Elderly property owners. I was 78 years old, not 88, and I'd been managing properties successfully for decades. But in their narrative, I was a burden who needed to be managed, rather than an asset owner making strategic decisions. Robert produced a bottle of expensive champagne and began pouring glasses for everyone. I think this calls for a toast, he announced, to family partnerships and shared prosperity. Everyone raised their glasses except me. I looked around the room at the faces watching me expectantly. My wife, my children, my brother, and 3 strangers who stood to profit from dismantling everything I'd built over 43 years of work. I appreciate all the thought you've put into this, I said, setting down my untouched champagne, but I'm not ready to make any decisions tonight. This is more complex than I realized, and I need time to review everything with my own advisors. The disappointment in the room was immediate and obvious. Richard Stone exchanged glances with the Morrisons, and I could see them calculating whether this deal was worth pursuing if I wasn't going to cooperate immediately. Of course, Dad, Sarah said, though her voice carried an edge of frustration. But don't wait too long. Some of these investment opportunities have limited windows, and we'd hate for you to miss out because of delays. I understand, but I've learned that the best investment decisions are made carefully, not quickly. I stood up, thanking Robert for dinner and shaking hands with his business associates. As I moved toward the door, I heard Robert say to Richard Stone, "Don't worry about Henry's hesitation. Once the legal arrangements are in place, these decisions will be made more efficiently." Once the legal arrangements are in place. meaning once I signed the power of attorney documents that would strip me of decision-making authority, then my family and their business partners could proceed without my interference. On the drive home, I thought about the evening's revelations. My family hadn't just planned to put me in assisted living and sell my properties. They'd already committed those properties as collateral for investment schemes that would benefit Robert and his associates while generating management fees for Sarah and David. I wasn't just losing my independence and my assets. I was funding my own displacement while generating profits for people who viewed me as an obstacle to be managed, rather than a patriarch to be respected. When I got home, I found a message on my answering machine from Jim Reynolds. Henry, the trust paperwork is complete and filed. All assets have been successfully transferred as of 5 o'clock this afternoon. You're now legally protected from the kind of family interference we discussed. Call me if you need anything. I smiled for the first time in weeks. My family thought they were closing in on their objective, but the objective had disappeared while they were planning their celebration. Tomorrow, they'd begin to understand how thoroughly their assumptions about my capabilities and assets had been wrong. The phone started ringing at 7:15 Wednesday morning. I was in my workshop, sanding the transom of a small dinghy I've been restoring, when I heard Marilyn answer with her usual cheerful greeting. That cheer disappeared quickly, replaced by increasingly agitated conversation that I could hear through the workshop windows. What do you mean the properties aren't available for collateral? Of course they're available. We have the owner's permission to proceed. I set down my sandpaper and listened more carefully. Marilyn was talking to someone about property transfers, her voice carrying the kind of confusion people get when reality doesn't match their expectations. I don't understand. The properties are owned by my husband Henry Callahan. We've been planning this transaction for weeks. A long pause, then what trust? What do you mean the properties have been transferred to a trust? I smiled and returned to my sanding. The Peninsula Development Group had apparently tried to move forward with their investment scheme, only to discover that the collateral they'd been counting on was no longer available. Richard Stone had probably spent his morning making phone calls to real estate attorneys and title companies, learning that Henry Callahan no longer owned the properties his family had promised to provide. 20 minutes later, Sarah's car pulled into my driveway, with the urgency of someone responding to an emergency. She was on her phone before she got out of the BMW, her voice sharp with frustration. I don't care what the title search shows, there has to be some mistake. My father wouldn't transfer his properties without telling us. But I had, and I'd done it with the same careful planning I'd once applied to naval engineering projects. Every detail calculated, every contingency anticipated, every document properly executed and filed. Sarah found me in the workshop, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, and her expression somewhere between confusion and anger. Dad, we need to talk. There seems to be some problem with the property titles. What kind of problem? The development company says the properties have been transferred to some kind of trust, but that's impossible, because you never mentioned setting up a trust. I set down my sandpaper and faced my daughter directly. The Callahan Family Trust was established last week. All of my real property has been transferred to the Trust for Protection and Management. She stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. What? Why would you do that without consulting us? The same reason you plan my future without consulting me. Sometimes important decisions need to be made independently. David arrived 15 minutes later, followed by Marilyn, who looked like she'd been crying. They assembled in my living room with the same positioning they'd used for the family meeting, except now their confident presentations had been replaced by desperate confusion. Henry, Marilyn began, I don't understand what's happening. Richard Stone called this morning, saying the investment partnership can't proceed because you've made the properties unavailable. What investment partnership? What did you tell him? I didn't tell him anything, but apparently someone promised him access to my properties as collateral for his development projects. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing frantically. Dad, this trust arrangement, whatever you've done, it's going to create massive complications for the family financial planning we've been working on. What family financial planning? You mean the planning that involved selling my house, putting me in assisted living, and using my properties to fund Robert's investment schemes? The silence that followed was deafening. David started to speak, stopped, then tried again. Dad, we were trying to help you. We were trying to create a more secure financial situation for everyone. Everyone meaning yourselves and Robert's business associates. Marilyn stood up abruptly. I'm calling Robert. He needs to know what's happening. She went to the kitchen to make her call, and I could hear her trying to explain the situation to my brother. Her voice grew more agitated as the conversation continued, punctuated by long pauses where Robert was apparently expressing his own frustration with the development. Robert says the Morrison people have already committed funds based on our property guarantees, Marilyn announced when she returned to the living room. If those properties aren't available, he could be liable for significant financial penalties. That sounds like Robert's problem, not mine. Sarah looked up from her laptop. Dad, you don't understand. Uncle Robert has already signed agreements with these development companies. He's personally guaranteed loans based on the understanding that our family properties would serve as collateral. I felt a familiar sensation from my Navy days, the moment when a carefully planned operation reaches its critical decision point. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Robert signed loan agreements and investment contracts based on properties he doesn't own, using my assets as collateral without my knowledge or consent. It wasn't supposed to work that way, David said defensively. The power of attorney documents would have made everything legal and proper. But I didn't sign those documents, because you didn't give us a chance to explain the full situation. I walked to my study and returned with a manila envelope I'd prepared the previous evening. Inside were copies of the trust documents, my updated will, and a letter from Jim Reynolds explaining the legal implications of the new arrangements. The full situation, I said, handing Sarah the envelope, is that I've legally protected my assets from exactly the kind of manipulation you've been planning. The properties are held in an irrevocable trust with the Port Townsend Maritime Museum as the primary beneficiary. Neither you nor Robert nor anyone else can use them as collateral for investment schemes. Sarah read through the documents, her face growing paler with each page. Dad, you've given away our inheritance. You've donated everything to a museum. I've donated my property to an organization that will use it to benefit the community and educate young people about maritime careers. Organizations that showed up when it mattered, unlike my family. Marilyn sank into her chair, staring at the legal papers like they were a death certificate. 52 years of marriage, Henry? 52 years and you're throwing it all away because of some misunderstanding about a birthday party? This isn't about a birthday party. This is about discovering that my family views me as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be respected. David was pacing now, his composure completely gone. You've destroyed Robert's business arrangements. You've sabotaged family financial planning that took months to develop. You've acted like some kind of dictator instead of consulting with people who care about you. People who care about me don't plan my future in secret. Don't prepare legal documents to strip away my independence, and don't promise my property to their business associates without my knowledge. The truth of that statement hung in the room like smoke from a house fire. My family had spent weeks, maybe months, developing plans that treated me like an incompetent obstacle to their financial goals. Now they were discovering that the obstacle had been paying attention and taking notes. Sarah closed her laptop with a sharp snap. There has to be a way to reverse this. Trust arrangements can be modified if there are grounds for questioning competency or undue influence. You're welcome to try, I said calmly. But you'll be arguing that a retired naval engineer who successfully managed complex ship construction projects for 4 decades suddenly became incompetent to handle his own property decisions. Good luck with that strategy. They left without saying goodbye, Sarah and David conferring in urgent whispers while Marilyn stared at me like I'd become a stranger. Maybe I had, maybe the Henry Callahan who would have signed their documents and moved obediently into assisted living had died on September 15th, sitting alone in his house with untouched birthday cake and empty chairs. The phone rang again that evening. Robert, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Henry, we need to fix this situation immediately. I've got financial obligations based on agreements we made in good faith. What agreements? I never agreed to anything. Family agreements, understandings based on conversations with Marilyn and the kids. Understandings that were apparently wrong. The silence stretched between us, filled with 40 years of me bailing him out of financial disasters, co-signing loans, and enabling his optimistic view of business opportunities. This isn't over, Henry. You're right, I said. It's just beginning. The local newspaper ran a small item about my donation 3 weeks later. Local veteran establishes Maritime Education Trust. The Port Townsend leader didn't go into details, but word travels fast in a town of 9,000 people, especially when it involves property transfers worth over $1 million. I was having coffee at the Salal Cafe when Betty Garrison approached my table, her smile genuine and warm. Henry, Pete, and I heard about your generous gift to the Maritime Museum. That's wonderful news for the community. The museum does good work, I said. They deserve support. We also heard there might be some family complications because of your decision. Betty's voice carried the careful tone people use when they're trying to be supportive without being intrusive. I hope you know that a lot of folks in town are proud of what you've